The royal court was a place of gold, silk, and cold hearts. Today, the air was thick with the smell of expensive incense and the sour taste of a lie. Elara, a girl whose life was measured in buckets of soapy water and worn-out brooms, stood trembling in the center of the great hall. The heavy marble floor she had polished until her fingers bled now felt like ice beneath her bare feet. "Thief!" a voice screamed, echoing off the high, painted ceilings. Lady Celine, a noblewoman with eyes like sharpened flint, stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger. "The sacred sun ring is gone, and this wretched floor sweeper was the only one near my chambers." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobles. They looked at Elara not with pity, but with a hungry sort of delight, as if her misfortune was a theater performance staged for their afternoon amusement. Elara tried to part her dry lips to speak, to tell them she had only been clearing away the cobwebs from the high windows, but her voice died in her throat. A heavy-handed guard struck her across the shoulder, forcing her to the ground. "Silence, girl," the High Chamberlain barked. Without a single shred of proof, the judgment was whispered, then spoken, then shouted. The sentence was passed with the swiftness of a falling guillotine. Elara was not sent to a dark dungeon. The nobles wanted to watch her suffer. She was sentenced to public penance. Heavy iron chains were snapped around her delicate ankles, the cold metal biting into her skin. Her task was to scrub the 1,000 steps of the palace entrance using only a small, rough stone and a bucket of lye. As the sun beat down, turning the white stone into a blinding furnace, Elara labored. Every movement was a fresh wave of agony. From the high balconies, the nobles watched, sipping chilled wine and laughing. Lady Celine stood at the very edge, a cruel smirk dancing on her painted lips. She leaned over the railing, intentionally spilling a goblet of dark red juice onto the steps Elara had just finished cleaning. "You missed a spot, thief," she mocked, her voice tinkling like broken glass. Elara did not look up. She did not cry out. She simply moved her bucket back up the step and began again. She realized then that this was no accident of fate. This was a trap, carefully set and spring-loaded, designed to crush a girl who had seen too much. The physical pain was a dull roar, but the sting of betrayal was a sharp, piercing needle. Among the crowd of servants watching from the shadows was Jaren, the only person Elara had ever trusted. They had shared crusts of bread in the cold winters and whispered dreams of the world beyond the palace walls. But when the High Chamberlain called for witnesses, Jaren stepped forward with his head bowed low. "I saw her," he whispered, his voice shaking with a cowardice that tasted like ash. "I saw Elara hiding something shiny in her tunic." Alara's heart did not just break, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked at him, searching for a glimmer of the friend she knew, but found only a boy consumed by fear of the whip. The nobles cheered at the truth, their mockery reaching a fever pitch. Despite the howling void in her chest, Elara did not scream his name or expose his lie. She took the weight of his betrayal and tucked it away in the quiet corners of her soul. She chose the heavy garment of silence over the jagged shards of hatred, continuing her labor as the shadows grew long and the palace grew colder. As she scrubbed, Elara's mind drifted back to her long years of invisible service. She had been a ghost in the palace, a shadow that moved with a broom. Because she was considered less than nothing, the powerful nobles spoke freely when she was in the room. She remembered the night she saw Lord Vane accepting a heavy purse of gold from a foreign spy near the rose gardens. She remembered Lady Celine whispering to the court physician about a slow-acting poison intended for a rival. Elara had never spoken a word of these secrets, but she had used her invisibility to do quiet good. She had sneaked extra broth to the elderly laundrywomen and hidden the mistakes of the younger pages so they wouldn't be beaten. She was a witness to the rot that lived behind the gold-leafed walls. The antagonist, Lady Celine, knew this. She had seen Elara's eyes, eyes that held too much understanding. The theft of the ring was not about jewelry, it was about permanent erasure. The lady feared exposure, and the only way to ensure Elara's silence was to destroy her spirit and her reputation until no word she spoke would ever be believed. By the third day, Elara reached her breaking point. The king sat upon his elevated dais in the courtyard, a distant and golden figure who seemed more like a statue than a man. He watched the proceedings with a detached, weary gaze, neither encouraging the cruelty nor stopping it. He was a king who had forgotten the feel of the earth beneath his feet. Elara was ordered to kneel in the center of the scorching courtyard for 6 hours without water. The heat was a physical weight, pressing her down until her forehead touched the grit of the stones. Her body trembled with exhaustion, and her breath came in ragged gasps. As she pressed her palms against the burning ground to keep from collapsing entirely, her skin tore. Blood, bright and crimson, began to seep from her right palm. As the liquid washed away the layers of dirt and lye, a faint, shimmering mark began to emerge on the center of her hand. It was an intricate swirl, like a star trapped in a drop of water. In her agony, Elara did not see it. The nobles were too busy laughing to notice, but the mark pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. In the deepest shadows of the arched walkway, an old man stood perfectly still. He wore the tattered robes of a simple gardener, but his eyes were as deep and ancient as the roots of the world. He was the master of records, a spiritual guide who had lived through the reigns of 3 kings. He had been watching Elara since she was a child, waiting for a sign he prayed would never have to appear. For the sign only appeared when a kingdom was dying from within. When the blood cleared and the shimmering mark on Elara's hand caught a stray beam of sunlight, the old man's breath hitched in his chest. It was the mark of the scale, the ancient symbol of the bearer of balance. Prophecy spoke of a time when the throne would grow death and the nobles would grow predatory. In that hour, the lowest of the low would be branded by fate to tear down the old and build the new. The old man gripped his staff, his knuckles turning white. "Not yet," he whispered to the wind, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The iron must be heated in the fire before it can be forged. Her spirit must endure a little longer." Lady Selene was not satisfied with mere public humiliation. She saw that Elara's spirit, though bent, was not yet broken. To finish the job, the lady produced a scroll, allegedly found in Elara's sleeping mat. "It is not just theft," Selene cried out, her voice echoing through the courtyard. "This girl has been in contact with the rebels of the northern wastes. She was plotting to poison the king's own well." A shocked silence fell over the court, followed by a roar of indignation. The king, finally moved from his apathy, sat forward, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "Is there proof?" he asked, his voice booming. Selene presented the forged scroll, sealed with a stolen signet. The evidence was undeniable. The nobles began to chant for her execution, their faces twisted in a mask of artificial outrage. The king looked down at the small, broken girl in the dirt. He felt a strange pang of doubt, but the pressure of the court was a tide he could not swim against. "Exile is too kind," the High Chamberlain whispered. "She must be cast into the black hole until we decide her." The black hole was a damp, windowless cell located beneath the palace foundations. There, the only sound was the rhythmic dripping of water and the scurrying of rats. Elara lay on the cold stone, her body a map of pain. For the first time, her resolve wavered. "Why?" she whispered into the darkness. "I only tried to be kind. I only tried to do my work. Why does the world reward the cruel and punish the honest?" As she drifted into a feverish sleep, a soft light filled the cell. She opened her eyes to see the old spiritual guide standing before her. He did not offer her food or water. He offered her a truth. "Child," he said softly, "the sun does not apologize for the shadows it casts. You carry the mark of the scale. The prophecy says that the one destined to restore balance must first carry the weight of the world's imbalance. Your suffering is not a punishment. It is your initiation. The kingdom's rot has reached the bone, and only one who has felt the teeth of that rot can truly heal it. He touched her hand, and for a moment, the pain vanished. Hope is a flame that burns best in the dark. The day of the final punishment arrived. The king had ordered that Elara be given 20 lashes before being cast out of the kingdom forever. A massive crowd gathered, including the common people who had heard rumors of the traitorous sweeper. Elara was led out, her head held high despite her weakness. As she was being tied to the wooden post, a young servant boy, no older than 7, accidentally tripped and spilled a bucket near a guard. The guard, angered by the interruption, raised his heavy whip to strike the child. Without thinking, Elara lunged forward, placing her body between the whip and the boy. The lash struck her across the back, tearing through her thin tunic. As she gasped in pain, she raised her hand to shield the child's face. In that instant, the clouds parted. A direct beam of pure golden sunlight hit the center of her palm. The mark of the scale did not just glow, it erupted in a brilliant, blinding white light that illuminated the entire courtyard. The guard fell back in terror, his whip dropping from his nerveless fingers. The king stood up so quickly his heavy throne groaned.
"Stop!" the king's voice thundered, vibrating through the stones of the palace. The executioner froze. The nobles who had been jeering suddenly became as silent as graves. The king descended the marble stairs, his heavy robes trailing behind him. He walked past the guards, past the trembling Lady Selene, and stopped directly in front of Elara. He took her small, scarred hand in his own and turned it over. The mark was no longer faint. It was etched into her skin like a brand of liquid silver, pulsing with a steady, calm light. The king's face went pale. He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him, the ancient prophecy of the bearer of balance who would appear when the crown had lost its way. "The mark of the ancestors," the king whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, terrible realization of his own failures. He looked at the girl he had allowed to be beaten and humiliated. He saw the strength in her eyes and the wisdom in her silence. A wave of cold fear spread among the nobles. They knew the legends too. If the girl was the bearer, then their time of secrets was coming to a bloody end.
The king immediately ordered Elara to be taken to the royal infirmary, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of the crown. He then commanded the master of records to bring the ancient archives to the throne room. For hours, the king pored over the crumbling parchments. The prophecy was clear. The bearer would be identified by a mark that only blood and fire could reveal. While the king read, panic gripped the upper floors of the palace. Lady Selene and Lord Vane met in a darkened corridor, their faces ashen. "We must destroy the records," Vane hissed, his hand trembling on the hilt of his sword. They attempted to bribe the archive guards to burn the scrolls, but the guards, having seen the light in the courtyard, refused to move. The atmosphere in the palace had shifted. The invisible servants were starting to look the nobles in the eye. Small whispers of rebellion were turning into a steady hum of expectation. Evidence of Selene's corruption, the stolen funds and forged documents began to surface as those she had bullied started to find their courage. The king suspended all punishments in the kingdom, sensing that a great storm was about to break. 3 days later, the palace doors swung open. A massive crowd had gathered at the gates, hearing rumors of a miracle. The king emerged, but he was not alone. Beside him stood Elara. She was no longer dressed in rags, but in a simple, elegant robe of deep blue. Her face was calm, her presence commanding a respect that no crown could buy. The king stepped forward and raised Elara's hand for all to see. "For too long I have sat upon this throne and allowed shadows to grow in the corners of my house," the king declared. "I have allowed the innocent to be trampled while the corrupt feasted at my table. Today, the ancestors have sent us a judge." In a move that sent shockwaves through the nobility, the king knelt before the former sweeper girl. "I name Elara the royal guardian of justice. Her word shall be as my word. Her hand shall hold the scales. No noble is too high for her reach, and no servant is too low for her protection." Lady Selene fainted where she stood, and a low, rhythmic cheering began among the commoners. growing into a roar that shook the very foundations of the city.
Elara did not waste a single moment. Her first act of authority happened before she even left the courtyard. A high-ranking duke, frustrated by the delay in his carriage, raised his cane to strike a stable hand who had fumbled with the harness. Before the cane could land, Elara was there. She didn't use a weapon. She simply caught the duke's wrist. Her grip was like iron, the mark on her hand glowing with a soft, warning light. "In this kingdom," Elara said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a mountain, "we do not strike those who serve us. You will apologize to this man, and you will pay him 3 months' wages for the fear you caused him." The duke blustered, his face turning a deep purple. "Do you know who I am?" he sputtered. Elara looked him in the eye, her gaze steady. "I know who you were. Now you are simply a man who has forgotten his manners. Do as I say, or you shall explain your conduct to the king's magistrates tonight." The duke, seeing the king watching from the balcony, bowed his head and stammered an apology. The court sensed a new, immovable force had arrived. Elara moved through the palace like a cleansing wind. She didn't look for gold. She looked for the truth hidden behind the gold-leafed walls. She opened the ledgers that had been sealed for decades, uncovering a vast web of bribery, stolen taxes, and cruel, unauthorized punishments. She discovered that Lady Celine had been stealing from the orphanage fund to pay for her silk dresses. She found that Lord Vane had been selling the kingdom's grain reserves to enemies while the peasants starved. The more she looked, the more the rot crumbled under her touch. One evening, as she sat in the high office once reserved for the High Chamberlain, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Jaren, the servant who had betrayed her. He fell to his knees, sobbing, his forehead touching the floor. "I was afraid, Elara. They threatened to kill my mother," he cried, begging for mercy. Elara looked at him with a mixture of pity and sadness. She did not feel the urge for revenge, but she knew that justice required more than just tears. "Fear is an explanation, Jaren, but it is not an excuse for a lie that kills. You will work in the mines to pay back the community." The time for quiet investigation was over. Elara called for a great assembly in the palace square. Thousands of people packed the area, their faces upturned and hopeful. Before the full court and the king, Elara stood with a stack of scrolls. She called forward a minor noble, Count Julian, who was known for his extreme cruelty toward his tenant farmers. "Count Julian," Elara said, her voice amplified by the silence of the crowd, "you have seized the lands of widows and imprisoned men for the crime of being poor. Here is the proof of your illegal seizures." She handed the scrolls to the king's judges. The evidence was irrefutable. "By the authority of the mark," Elara declared, "your titles are stripped. Your lands are returned to the families you robbed. You shall spend the next 5 years working the very fields you stole." The crowd erupted in a deafening cheer. The shockwaves spread through the rows of nobles. Those who had spent their lives thinking they were untouchable now looked at each other with trembling hands. They realized that Elara wasn't just looking for minor errors. She was dismantling a system of oppression stone by stone. The big names began to tremble. Lady Celine, realizing that her turn was coming, decided to strike first. She requested a private audience with the king, using her family's long history to gain entry. "Your Majesty," she pleaded, her voice dripping with fake concern, "this girl is not a savior. She is an opportunist using a trick of the light to seize power. She seeks to turn the commoners against you. Already they chant her name louder than yours. If you do not stop her, there will be no crown left to wear." The king looked out the window at the crowds cheering for Elara. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He had been a king for a long time, and the fear of losing his throne was a powerful poison. "She has been effective," the king murmured, his voice uncertain. Celine leaned in closer, her eyes gleaming. "She is building an army of the poor. She will replace your laws with her whims." But just as the king began to nod, the door opened. Elara walked in, holding a single tattered ledger. She did not look at Celine. She simply placed the book on the king's desk. "I do not want your throne, Majesty. I want your people to be able to sleep without fear."
The tension in the throne room was thick enough to choke. Elara opened the ledger to a page dated 10 years ago. "This is the record of the king's secret charities," she said. "The funds you thought were going to the poor were diverted by Lady Selene into a private estate in the south." Selene screamed that it was a forgery, but Elara waved her hand. From behind the curtain, 3 hidden witnesses stepped forward: a disgraced accountant, a former guard, and an old maid who had served Selene for 20 years. One by one, they spoke. They told of the threats, the bribes, and the calculated cruelty. Even the royal guards, men who had been paid to be silent, began to speak up, describing how Selene had ordered them to beat servants for minor infractions. Selene's lies began to crumble like dry sand. She looked to Lord Vane for help, but he turned his back on her, trying to save himself. The king watched as the woman he had trusted for years was revealed to be a monster. His doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. The final confrontation was now inevitable, and the court knew the lady's fate was sealed. The grand hall was packed for the final judgment. Lady Selene stood in the center, stripped of her jewels and fine silks. Elara stood opposite her, the mark of the scale glowing with a fierce silver intensity that seemed to fill the room. "You accused me of stealing a ring," Elara said, her voice resonating with an ancient power. "But it was you who stole the lives and hopes of thousands. You traded the kingdom's future for your own vanity." Under the immense pressure of Elara's gaze and the weight of the evidence, Selene's composure finally broke. She fell to her knees, screaming a confession of all her crimes: the theft, the forgeries, and the plot to poison the king's mind. She begged for mercy, her face a mask of terror. As she spoke, the shimmer in the hall grew so bright that many had to shield their eyes. It was as if the spirits of the ancestors were present, demanding an accounting. The king stood and raised his scepter. "The bearer of balance has spoken," he declared. "The time of shadows is over. Judgment shall be rendered tomorrow at dawn in the public square for all to see. No one is above the law." Judgment Day was a day the kingdom would never forget. It was not a day of blood, but a day of intense, undeniable justice. Lady Selene and Lord Vane were brought before the people. Their titles were officially removed, their ancestral wealth seized and moved into a public treasury to rebuild the schools and hospitals they had neglected. For their crimes, they were not executed. Elara believed that death was an easy escape. Instead, they were sentenced to life in exile, forced to live as the very peasants they had despised, working for their daily bread in a distant province. Other corrupt leaders were cast down, their positions filled by men and women of proven character. The palace archives were open to the public, ensuring that no secret could ever grow that large again. As the corrupt were led away in chains, the people did not jeer with hatred. They cheered with a profound sense of relief. The air felt lighter, the sun seemed brighter, and for the first time in generations, the people felt that the palace belonged to them as much as it did to the king. Justice was real, and it was beautiful. In the aftermath of the Great Trial, many expected Elara to be a harsh ruler, but she proved that true power lies in the ability to distinguish between malice and mistake. She called forward those who had acted against her out of fear, the servants who had remained silent, the guards who had followed cruel orders because they had families to feed. She did not punish them. Instead, she offered them a choice: to remain and serve the new justice, or to leave with a small sum to start a new life. "A kingdom built on fear will always crumble," she told them. "A kingdom built on respect will stand forever." Her justice was firm when it came to those who abused power, but it was incredibly wise and merciful toward the vulnerable. She established a council of servants to advise the king, ensuring that the voices of the floor sweepers would always be heard in the halls of gold. Her reputation grew, and soon people from neighboring kingdoms traveled just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had turned a broom into a scepter of truth. Respect for her grew deeper than any fear could ever reach. The king, seeing the peace and prosperity that Elara had brought in such a short time, made a startling announcement. He called Elara to the throne in front of the entire court. "I am old," the king said, his voice weary but satisfied. "And I have learned that being a king is not about the crown on one's head, but the service in one's heart. Elara, you have saved this kingdom from itself. You have the wisdom I lacked and the courage I forgot. I offer you the throne. I offer you supreme authority over all these lands. Rule us, and we shall be great." A hush fell over the hall. The nobles held their breath. The commoners waited with pounding hearts. It was the ultimate payoff. The girl from the floor becoming the queen of the world. Elara looked at the golden throne, then at the king, then at the sea of faces waiting for her answer. She felt the weight of the crown, even before it touched her head. She knew that with a single word, she could have everything she had ever been denied. She took a long, slow breath, her hand resting on the hilt of the scales of justice. "I thank you, Majesty," Elara said, her voice clear and resonant. "But a throne is a place of walls, and I have spent enough time inside walls. If I become queen, I become another symbol that people fear or worship from a distance. That is not my destiny." The court gasped in disbelief. "I choose to remain the royal guardian of justice," she continued. "I will not sit on a throne. I will walk the streets. I will not wear a crown. I will wear the clothes of the people. I choose to be a servant of the law, not the master of it. My authority comes from the scale, not from a title." The king was stunned, then moved to tears. He realized that her refusal of power was the ultimate proof of her worthiness. The nobles, who had feared a new tyrant, now bowed in genuine admiration. They saw a level of integrity they had never imagined possible. Elara's influence spread not through decrees, but through her presence. She became the living conscience of the kingdom, a reminder that the greatest power is the power to say no to one's own ambition for the sake of the greater good. The changes in the kingdom were visible in every corner. In the palace, the atmosphere transformed from one of hushed whispers and terror to one of transparency and pride. Servants now walked with their heads held high, speaking their minds without the fear of the lash. Corruption plummeted because there was nowhere for it to hide. The Mother of Justice, as the people began to call her, was everywhere. She sat in the kitchens to hear the complaints of the cooks. She stood in the stables to ensure the animals and the men were treated well. She established a system where any citizen, regardless of status, could bring a grievance directly to her. The kingdom flourished. Trade increased because merchants knew the contracts would be honored. Farmers worked harder because they knew their harvests wouldn't be stolen by greedy tax collectors. The palace floors were still swept every day, but now they were swept by people who were paid fairly and treated with dignity. The very stones of the palace seemed to glow with a new light, as if the spirit of the kingdom had finally been washed clean of its long-standing grime. 1 year after the Great Trial, a ceremony was held to celebrate the new era. As Elara walked through the grand hall, the very nobles who had once mocked and spat upon her now stood and bowed deeply as she passed. This was not the bow of forced obedience, but the bow of genuine, hard-earned respect. Even the most arrogant among them had seen the prosperity that honesty brought. The king stood at the end of the hall, beaming with a pride he had never felt for his own bloodline. He publicly praised her courage, naming her the soul of the realm. Elara looked around the room, seeing Jaren, who was now a lead gardener, working hard to redeem himself. She saw the young boy she had protected, now a page with a bright future. The palace that had once been her prison was now her home, and the people who had been her tormentors were now her partners in peace. The silence of the court was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of a deep, collective peace. She had accomplished what no army could. She had conquered the hearts of a nation without shedding a drop of blood. Elara walked the same palace floors she had once swept as a child. She still carried a broom sometimes, just to remind herself of where she came from. The people honored her, and children often followed her, calling her the light of the scale. As the sun set over the prosperous city, Elara looked down at her hand. The shimmering mark, once so bright and demanding, had begun to fade. Its mission was fulfilled. The balance had been restored. The prophecy was complete. She was no longer a chosen instrument of fate. She was simply a woman who had done what was right. Her name became a legend, a story told to every child, to remind them that no one is truly invisible and that truth has a way of rising, no matter how deep it is buried. The kingdom learned that the lowest among them could become the light that changed everything. She stood on the balcony, looking out at a world that was fair, kind, and full of hope. The ones who forced her to kneel never imagined she would rise, not to rule with fear, but to remake the kingdom with the very hands that once scrubbed its floors. The kingdom learned that the hands they once forced to scrub their floors were the very hands destined to cleanse their corruption.